I welcome everyone to this session from the Gender and Trade Coalition and the Women in Migration Network. We're really pleased that you have joined us, and I want to pass this to our convener, Liepollo, to begin our session. Welcome.
Thanks, Carol, and thanks to all of us who've managed to gather ourselves on this Friday the 9th, to have this conversation. We're delighted that you could all turn out. This is part of a series that is being run in conjunction with the Gender and Trade Coalition and the Women in Migration Network, both very important networks which many of us are part of. I consider myself a co-citizen, a joint citizen of both, with people like Carol, people like Mariama, and others. The focus of this meeting today and of this is really to have an interactive conversation about the intersections between international trade and migration, particularly gendered or feminist approaches to migration. And we really want to dig into a few key issues. The one being whether or not, in fact, the current construction, the intersection between trade and migration has the opportunity to be reframed right now. Also thinking around the links between gendered migration and extractive labor patterns. And lastly, thinking through what a COVID-centered approach would look like, right? So what a COVID-centered, bottom-up, people-centered, women-centric post-COVID world and post-COVID economy could potentially look like. Then I'm also going to open this conversation up to really reframe and reimagine what states are, and states as protectors, states as enablers, and states often as really which have often vacated their role in relation to social protections, which is why the healthcare system is in the situation that it's in, which is why we're having these questions around biocolonialism and pharma imperialism, biosecurity, movement of people, and the securitization of that movement under the guise of healthcare, under the guise, of course, of infection control and so forth. And it links to, a whole bunch of other issues that we're probably going to touch on. So I welcome all of us, and I'm gonna introduce all of the speakers consecutively so that we can dive right in. So first I'm gonna introduce Mariama Williams, who is part of the Gender and Trade Coalition, but among many other things, she has a rich history as part of one of the founders of the International Gender and Trade Network. She's been a member of the Secretariat of DAWN. She's also worked at the South Center. She's one of our leading feminist economist scholars, and also a leading thinker in the area of migration and climate change. And I welcome her very warmly. Our second speaker is going to be Fatimah Kelleher, and she's currently associated with ActionAid and with the Nawi Collective, but she also self-identifies as a Pan-Africanist feminist thinker. She has done a lot of the thinking on the continent and in the African diaspora around free trade agreements, around feminist economics, around macroeconomics as well. And I welcome her also very warmly. And last and never least is a comrade sister, Crecentia Mofokeng, who's an old sister, an old friend, a mentor to me on a personal level as well, part of my personal political journey, and a very important figure in particular in South Africa in the trade union movement and beyond. And she's part of the Building and Woodworkers International, responsible for both Africa and the Middle East region, and responsible for migration for women and for developing those sectors. And she's been part of conversations, including in the GFMD and the UN and ILO and so forth. So I welcome all of you very, very warmly, and I welcome all of us who are on this call on this Friday. So I'm going to ask each of the speakers to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to circle back to a brief question and answer Q&A. I invite all of us who are on the call, who are in the audience, to just keep on making comments and inputs, use the chat. I don't know if we have a Q&A box, but I'm also using a very archaic version of Zoom, so anything is possible. But please use the chat box. Please engage, ask questions, raise issues and written questions as we're going along, and hopefully we can lift these up and have a really vibrant round of questions. And then we're going to come back to another panel discussion, which is going to deal with states as the enablers of the dignified movement of women. And without further ado, I'd like to invite my big sister Mariama to make her comments on the intersection between trade and migration. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good night, everyone. I know people are calling in from different time zones, so welcome. Thank you all for coming to this, participate in this discussion. It's great to be with my friends. Fatimah, I haven't seen Fatimah in a good 10 years probably. And I just want to say, as a card-carrying Garveyite, I am also identifying as a Pan-African feminist, so that's great. Wonderful to see my good friend Carol, who I see a lot on Zoom recently, and who just has had such great care and love and kindness for the global women's movement in all its dimensions. Now she's focusing on migration, which is a very important topic. Leopoldo, you are just such a brilliant, I try to follow all your YouTube discussions, especially around what was happening with South Africa and the various economic dimensions of lockdowns and various things. Brilliantly articulated, so thank you. Crecentia, my new friend, I haven't met you, but I know of the work of the trade unions, and particularly South African trade unions are really good on this whole question of just transition and what climate is doing to workers everywhere. Venema, I'm not sure I've met you, but welcome. And all of the other speakers, welcome. So I'm going to talk a little bit about migration and trade, and I just want to start my discussion, my entry into this discussion, just by making 3 points, right? One is that trade and migration linkage go way, way back, okay, to colonialism and even pre-colonialism. So we had the greater dimension of trade, we must remember, started with going out to what they thought was East Asia and India and other places, Africa and other places. And we have the transnational cooperation, the forerunner, pre-forerunner even of the transnational cooperation, were the various Dutch and British East India companies that were trading various items and bringing back slaves to the New World. So so we could make a distinction about forced migration and other form of migration, climate migration, people migrating because of the catastrophe caused in the Middle East as a result of the intervention and the various intervention of the US and its allies since the 9/11 debacle, without actually discussing what the nature of those interventions were and why those dramas happen. So we see now what we're in now. We're in an area of the problematization of migration. Earlier forms of migration was not so highly politicized and problematized because they were going from Europe into what are now our countries. And so it was quite a wide open terrain. The companies were given charters by their various kings and queens to carry out their trade and ply their trade. Now we see this systematization and even a stigmatization of migration and migrants in Europe and in the US, and the kind of unwelcoming attitude. Now, I don't mean to imply that there was never any drama occurring between natives and migrants, because there's always been this drama about either land prices or workers and so forth. So that's ongoing. What I'm talking about is almost a systematic, elitist presentation of migrants that you see occurring within discussions in the EU, in the US, and other kinds of places where the migrants are the other coming to take something. Whereas before, when the Europeans went out and took, there was not that kind of drama about it for very good reasons we know of. But we need to place this discussion within that context, that this flow has been going back and forth for many, many years. Okay, so the history of migration has been, and I don't have time to go to the different ways, but we've had many ways. The current global migration, really we could say it's probably from about World War I to present, and you even that you could distinguish in different range, and you could see how trade has impacted. So we had the slavery part, we have the 1930s, the rise of the US and the welcoming of migrants for labors and industrialization, including migrants from the Caribbean and from Africa in the need of cheap labor. So we have all of those things. After World War II, again, welcoming. Then the post-1970s, we see that when migrants started going from Asia to and Africa to Europe, there was a lot of discussion going around that. And at the same time, even as the discussion has been going on around what do we do about these migrants coming in, there has not been a systematic process of taking them on board. There's been a reluctance, both by sending countries and host countries, to formulate any kind of international binding agreements on looking at migrants. So we have these different dimensions going on with the migration discussions. So I'd like to then jump a little bit to the present. So we have now a growing population of migrants who are rapidly going from the global south to the global north for a variety of reasons, and we need to investigate and thoroughly interrogate those reasons and establish the factual basis of those. So migration then, we see in terms of what is the benefit of it for developed and developing countries. We know that mostly, currently, the benefits of migration, a lot of the research I've been looking at argues that most of it is going to the host country, the receiving countries. The outcome of what goes to developing countries, are in terms of maybe some recruitment effects, remittances, of course, which have overtaken ODA, Official Development Assistance, dramatically. And the numbers on remittances, I'll come back to that in a minute. So the migration, trade, and development nexus is very complex, but it's not difficult to intertwine, to unweave, to see what is going on. We also now have more literature. There's been a literature that says women are now comprising a lot of the migration. But there's literature going back. I was looking at some literature to show that women have always been a significant proportion of migration. It's just that they were underreported. They came with families and friends. Now they're coming on their own. So 50% of global remittances are coming from women. And if we remember, the women are in the lower wage categories of this. What we have are formal systems addressing what are primarily male migration, right? In terms of the GATS agreement mode 4. We still don't have significant coverage for teachers and nurses who are primarily female moving around. We had some code of conduct. I remember once the Commonwealth talked about trying to put a code of conduct among Commonwealth countries about the recruitment of nurses, teachers, and doctors. So today we have quite a number of issues, of development issues around migration, right? Trade theory tells us that migration and trade were substitute, Exchaholin model. The new discussions of trade said that's not correct. In fact, trade and migration are complement. And that we see a lot of work that says that companies are increasing their profits and productivity through incorporation migrant workers or migrants into their value chains, both in the receiving country and at home. So that there's a complementarity, and that migration flows are actually helping international trade flows. Now, all of that, as we know, is coming to a little bit of a slowdown, or maybe a giant stop for some as a result of the COVID. So we don't know how rapid the growth in migration will be to developed countries as a result of these new trends toward vaccination, visas, and other kinds of things. But we do know that a lot of migrants have contributed both onshore and offshore to the growth of international trade and to the development of existing companies, as well as the formulation of new companies, all right? Lastly, I wanted to flag, and I'll come back to some of this. I want to look a little bit at the challenges of immigration, right? So the challenges are outside, of course, in the sending countries, the erection of entry barriers, and the discussion around the impact of migrants on the labor market. And we see a proliferation of restrictive measures, and that is segmenting migration. So the migrants that have skills, computers and others have preferential access. Those with lower skills have no protection and no workers' rights. So the whole workers' right dimension of migrants. Then we have the other wave about the illegal immigration. Who are the illegal immigrants and what are the policy around legalization? And those we see a proliferation of those in the US, of course, Spain, Italy, and other places, Australia, that are developing these. So we need to interrogate those and how are they protecting workers' rights, and in particular, how are they dealing with women? But there's a whole literature, a part of the literature in this trade migration discussion that talks about the trade facilitation effects of migration, which is that migrants help to increase exports because they bring knowledge. They help to decrease the fixed cost of the firms because of their knowledge of their local, especially service firms. So there's a whole distinction between merchandise trade, the impact of migration on merchandise trade, and the impact of migration on services. A lot of the research had to date been about migration, merchandise trade. Increasingly, a lot of the research is saying migration is really critical to services, legal services, any service that has to do with needing understanding of the culture and needing understanding of the institutional process. Migrants are very critical to that, both at home, both when they return, circular migrants, and the ones who are staying in wherever they find themselves. They also impact imports. So the trade facilitation is both on the export and the import side because of the consumption, right? Because of their living in these new economies, they're still maintaining their cultural preferences. So like I went to the supermarket in the US, and these are Publix. Publix is a huge chain. It has, and supermarket space in the US is very scarce and very highly coveted. It had almost 1/4 of a shelf that was Asian, and within that there was a Jamaican, specifically Jamaican, carrying all the Jamaican products, then African. So again, you see this, and some of these are local firms that are in joint venture with these big global chains. So you see that trade facilitation aspects of the migrants. So the benefits of immigration is, of course, to promote exports of final goods and services at home for imports. And they also are supposed to bring productivity gains to the labor market. Both are true because they bring skill, they bring knowledge, they bring know-how, which increases the productivity at home. And of course, they can reduce offshore inactivity because instead of setting up productivity in a production chain in Africa, you could have them here and use the migrants there. And some companies are doing that. In terms of development, we have the recruitment effect. And there's a little paradox I found about that the least skilled migrants don't tend to migrate because they're too poor, and migration is actually quite expensive. It's an expensive, and a guy named Taylor at UC Davis has done some work on that. Then you have also they have remittances. And now, as I said before, it's now a major part of what's happening for developing countries. It decreases poverty. It helps to increase well-being by increasing the consumption of different segments of the population. It also helps to decrease the labor supply, in particular for low-wage labor. And it also helps to increase spending of the population, so therefore contributing to GDP, apart from the overall mega contribution of migrations to GDP. I took a look at the numbers this morning, and for instance, Tonga gets 38% of a nominal GDP from remittances. It's only 0.19 billion, but for them it's a lot. Haiti is second. It gets 34% of its remittances from GDP. That's about $3.3 billion. Nepal would be third, and of course, Tajikistan from Europe would be the fourth, 29% of their GDP. Now, what we're talking about is official measures, right? This is IMF measure, which means they're only using employment compensation. We're not including in here transfers sent by Wells Fargo, transfers sent through post office, transfers sent through cell phones, or informal transfer. So migrants are really upholding significant amount of our economy. Jamaica many years ago, I haven't seen a new figure, I didn't get time to look for it, but was $2.5 billion, right, in 2015. And remember that women are sending 50% of this, and women are at the lower end of the wage in every figure. The last figure I saw that documented women was in the UN Women publication, but that was for 2016, so I just presented for the scale. Women are 50% of the $601 billion in global remittances that occurred in 2016. So if you forward to 2020, well, to 2019, 2020 is going to be an anomaly because we know that. Well, the other dynamics that we need to talk about a little bit is the brain drain, right? And that's one of the more pressing issues in the migration, trade, development issue area, right? So we find that the more we educate, developing countries educate personnel, the more they're recruited abroad. And so that has positive and negative dimension. Positive dimension is that there's a premium for education. So more people want to be educated. The negative is, of course, they get recruited out. And unless our developing countries are able to put in place processes that will attract them and keep them at home, this is in terms of technology, in terms of investment, in terms of improving institutional quality, and also democracy. And again, I use the word democracy. That's something we have to unpack for ourselves, what it means for each area, right? So that there's a paradox in the brain drain is that, you know, the more you educate, it's an incentive to go to school, but at the same time, it's an incentive to prepare to be recruited to go abroad. And of course, the talk about remittance is a big part of it. And I will kind of stop there. And then we can have some discussions around that, because I haven't been checking the time, but I'm sure I like to talk a lot, so I'm sure it's gone quite a lot.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mariama. And thank you very much for bringing into sharp focus the financial contributions, the intellectual contributions, the skill contributions, and really upending this notion of migrations and migrants and Black and brown people as desperate victims, and really actually centering us as the people who are contributing and have an intellectual repository and an investment in northern countries, and actually a really dynamic contribution to make. And I mean, not only financial remittances, knowledge remittances, cultural remittances as well. And having grown up in different countries, also having been a migrant refugee at some stage in my life, the joys of seeing food that was familiar on the shelves, and not, of course, understanding and making the connection between the economics of that. So, you know, migration as part of cultural economics and a cultural remittance. And I'd really love for Crecentia to pick it up right there. There's a lot that you said around the impact of migration on labor markets and preferential access. And I'd love Comrade Crecentia to perhaps jump in right there. Thank you, Crecentia.
Good afternoon, comrades, and I hope it's good to call you comrades. Good morning to all of you. Good afternoon, wherever you are. Indeed, it's a great honor to join this conversation. My dear sister Liepollo, thank you for the invite. My fellow panelists, just very inspiring to listen to Mariama to talk about really the impact, but also the benefits of migration globally. Of course, I'm going to talk about the part which is passionate in my heart, the one that deals with gender and women on migration in Africa, but also in the world of work. We meet at the most difficult period in the history of our time. Africa continues to face humanitarian crisis as a combination of drought, civil conflict, economic decline threatening. This has been worsened by COVID-19. And it has not only shaped the strongest economy and healthcare systems, but ultimately threatened to shut down the world. And this also impacts in what we are discussing today on issues of gender and migration, but also trade. I looked at a little bit about on the statistics, And I found that according to the UN data, in 2020, it was reported that around 135 million people are migrating around the world. And meaning that in our continent alone, it's almost over 50% who are migrating. Although it was said that when I talk about my continent, please take me, I'm a Pan-Africanist, I'm talking about Africa. We are also talking about that if you look at that share of migration, that it was said that 49.4% were women who were migrating around the world. And between 2000 and 2020, the increase in the migration of women also rapidly went high. And I think it talks really to the fact that Mariama told about that if you look at remittances, most now are coming from women. Some of them are single parents, they are head of the families, and they have to feed their families wherever they are. For some time now existed a myth that only men migrate. Mm-hmm. And if women do migrate at all, they are single or they follow their spouses. But trends have shown that women do migrate for several reasons. And I said that for greener pastures, because of high unemployment in various countries, for political conflict, and you look at the conflicts around the world, but also in our continent, women flee from abusive relationships, lack of opportunities at home, lack of policies protecting all workers' rights and in their home countries. I also really thought that it is good to highlight these issues around migration and gender, that the experiences in particular of women in less feminized sectors of the economy have received much less attention. For instance, in the sector where I come from, in the building construction, wood and forest, that is male dominated, you barely talk about what are the impacts that are facing women migrant workers, and they are there. And that is the reason why we developed a policy as BWI to make sure that we really address the issues of migrant workers. Little is known about women involvement in the new and emerging sectors of the labor market. A migrant worker's choice of a job is constrained by gender division of labor that characterizes the world of work, because women are always discriminated. Women always find themselves at the bottom of the ladder. Their choices of how much they earn. Mariama talked about how educated women are. We get educated, but it does not pay the same with regards to income. In the world of work, we are at the bottom of the ladder. No one recognizes our ability to do the work. You can compare yourself with a male counterpart. You find that we are really paid at the bottom. Migrant women workers are often employed in jobs at the bottom ranks, which typically involve tasks that are culturally devalued, receive limited social, legal recognition, lowly paid, no minimum wage, no social protection. And this includes also pension and the provident fund, whatever you can call it. Recent research shows that greater female inclusion in the extractive labor patterns always benefit employers, not women. They don't benefit women. They benefit the employer who are employing them, because the employer make more profit. They really have they have a pool of workforce that is loyal, because they want to safeguard the job. And that is the reason why that we are saying that the women, the trade and movement have a role to play in defending the rights of these vulnerable workers. We don't overrule the experience of sexual exploitation. Women face being trafficked from country to country. Documented this was documented by Friedman in the case of West African, Central Africa in 2012. I also looked at where do we find women? And I found that the women migrant workers, they go to their domestics, they move from rural to urban, they cross border, they are in a bilateral agreement. I have been in a plane where you find that 90% of the plane, it is young Ethiopian women. And I was asking myself, where are these women going to in the Arab region? They said, no, we have a job. We are going to be domestic workers. But these bilateral agreements don't protect nobody. They benefit the countries, maybe countries of origin or countries of destination. But the women themselves are abused. Some of them go back home, not with their feet, but with their bags. They're in the agricultural sector, forest sector and farm sector, and you can name them. They are in service, hair beauty, sex work. They are in cleaning services. They are in care, health, old age. They are also in trade, cross-border, dressmaking. You can name them. That's where we find them. And I also looked at what instruments that are there in the labor market that can protect these workers. These instruments are adopted to improve conditions of migrant workers. The ILO Convention 189 of 2011 and its recommendation 201, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, CEDAW of 1979, and its recommendation of number 26. And then also we have a comment adopted by the Committee of Experts on Migrant and Domestic Workers on protection of rights on all migrant workers and their families, CMW, ratified by 24 countries only. In Africa, it is South Africa in 2013 and Guinea in 2017. And we can look how these instruments are prioritized. In Africa, if you look into our economic bloc, SADC adopted a policy on labor migration, and this was meant to protect migrant workers who are crossing around the borders. ECOWAS and East Africa Community also adopted policy on free movement of people, and also we have these bilaterals that are signed between countries. And if you look at this, I said, one of the regimes are the visa and the work permit visas, which are not benefiting because you are given a job, a formal job, when you have a work permit, when you have a visa into a country. But sometimes you find that majority of these have to do with how countries proportionate the skill that you have. And it is upon the country to prioritize if you can come or not come. And therefore, women, as Mariama said, they find themselves in this expensive journey to pay these recruitment agencies so that they can be able to find their places in the countries where they can find a job. We also had hope that on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the AFCTA envision not only to simply a free trade agreement, but as a vehicle for economic transformation, through its protocols expected to facilitate the movement of persons, of labor, competition, investment, and intellectual property. We hope that, we had a hope that this important instrument will be able to make sure for once Africa had something of their own that can be used if consultations are done in an appropriate and through all stakeholders in the continent. But it was postponed and all negotiations were halted until December 2021. If we look at the impact of COVID-19 and migration, and we say that the lockdown, social distancing, measured deployment to curb spread of COVID-19 have seen numerous employment grind to halt, with many countries permitted essential services to continue, but also stopping the entire economic trend. And migrant workers find themselves in this piece, because many of the people who really had negative impact were migrant workers, particularly women migrant workers. You had also children. They had to look after children. They had to look after families who were getting sick. And migrant women workers could not move to go back home to their countries. The social protection of the countries where they were not protecting them. And therefore, as a result, they really were in a dire situation. And as a result, we needed to develop some form of an interaction between employers and the trade union movement to make sure that these migrant workers can get food, they can get really this protection that will help them against the COVID-19. And then also because of these shutdowns, violence against women really increased, and the role of women in different countries really were impacted negatively by the pandemic. And then we have seen also worldwide that the pandemic not only opened this violence against women, that many women were trafficked, domestic abuse also increased, and child marriages also increased as a result of COVID-19. And I end to leave room for questions and say that no doubt that the trade union movement along its value chain have a role to play and to continue to defend, to protect the rights of migrant workers, and particularly the vulnerable women, migrant and young workers. They must continue to define, because we have these, I talked about these instruments that are ratified, adopted, but these instruments need to be domesticated in various countries, and they are not. They need to be implemented. So the trade union movement must make sure that they're domesticated, they're implemented, and they are monitored to ensure that whoever benefits is none but women themselves and the migrant workers in general and their families. They must continue to educate migrant women workers on their rights and make sure that no employers have a tendency, comrades, whether it is employers at national level or employers at multinational level, they always try to steal the benefits of workers, and to make sure that workers do get their benefits when they go back home. In BWI, we were working in Qatar, making sure that migrant workers who were building stadiums are protected, their rights are protected, including fighting that the kafala system is abolished. And this is very important that BWI was able to engage with the authorities in Qatar to make sure that really it is not that violations can be really can continue like this, but the rights of migrant workers who are working in Qatar are protected. And therefore, now we are working on the legacy piece, where we are saying that migrant workers should be allowed to continue to work in the various fields after building the stadiums. And we are also saying that government must mainstream gender legislation and policies and create opportunities not only for few people, but for all. Comrades, I thank you for listening to me, and I wait for the questions.
Thank you so much, Crecentia, for quite a panoramic exposition, I suppose, of the labor markets, of I think, really a challenge to the gaps in policy, the gaps in gendered policy and the gaps in economic and migration policy, the kind of lack of interest I think that states have in actually ensuring that these are ratified, domesticated, and thus prioritized. I think there's also an interesting piece between the role of the sending nations and the receiving nations, and this black hole of abuses, of exploitation, of extractivism, of Black and brown women's bodies that takes place all through that value chain, the labor value chain, the intellectual value chain, the skills value chain, the remittance value chain, the lack of social protection. And I think also the notion of how the different kinds of violence, and I think the violence against physical violence is one component of that, but one would also see all those layers, those violations between the sending and the receiving countries as different layers of structural and systemic violence, often enabled by states. And I'm hoping that we can perhaps mine what you have said and mine on those threads as we go into the second piece of our discussion. And mindful of time, I would love to draw on my comrade sister Fatimah to make her remarks as well. And I think she's going to take us through an exposition on the COVID-centered approaches to international trade and labor architecture. So it's over to you, Fatimah.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much to sisters Crecentia and Mariama. And to be honest with you, some of what I'm going to speak about has already been covered, but what I'm hoping I'll be able to do here is give more of that COVID background and the impacts and essentially where we have been in the last year and where that puts us very critically now. So I think it's not news that obviously women have been more negatively impacted by the pandemic, and related disruptions to trade in particular have impacted developing and least developed countries the most. But, different from previous global crises, where we've had trade-related impacts, many of which actually fell onto men who were within more traditional business cycles. This time around, that additional factor of lockdown and distancing measures has had a clear gendered characteristic as well. And the international trade and labor architecture, the flaws within that have been further exposed, its iniquities essentially. So, in terms of international trade and value chains, we know that women in the manufacturing sector in particular have been impacted. Industry orders halved pretty much in the first months of the pandemic. And globally, women workers are a massive share of the manufacturing sector. And in some countries, the most well-known, I suppose, at the moment being Bangladesh and others that are similar, they completely dominate. But as we also know, the gendered segregation of labor and the exploitations that come from that mean they are in the least well-paid jobs, the most insecure contracts, meaning when decisions are needed to be taken when it comes to who to furlough, who to lay off, women are effectively at the forefront of that. And we have seen that in, I would say, pretty much every single country study that I have read, regardless of whether you are so-called developed, developing, or least developed. And many women, in sectors specifically that have been impacted by travel restrictions, such as tourism and hospitality. We have seen how that has had a critical gendered characteristic to it as well. Now, domestically, we know that women disproportionately present in what is called the informal sector of the economy. And the options around remote work have not only been less available, but the continuing gendered digital divide, as well as pervasive, educational inequalities mean that women have been less able to transition into what we now know as the so-called new normal of online virtual working structures, effectively what we are doing today. So what we have found is that women either have lost their income through the impacts of, heavily gender segregated, unjust value chains, or continue to risk their lives by having to be on the forefront of exposure to the pandemic. It's already been well documented, for example, how entire national domestic needs during lockdown were facilitated by women traders in markets that were allowed to remain open during lockdown so that everyone could get their essentials. But it has also been clearly demonstrated that these women did not, for the most part, benefit from the type of additional provisions that were made for designated key and frontline workers, despite the very clear fact that their roles fit within those groupings. And so then when we look at this, from the migrant perspective, women migrant workers have been even more harmfully impacted as a result of that. And both Mariama and Crecentia have gone into this. So, what we see is migrant women facing multiple intersection oppressions, most notably the restrictions on migration, policies, as well as the insecure forms of labor that women generally experience, but also, added to that, racism and xenophobia, which has heightened, not just as a result of the pandemic, but very specifically, I would argue, in the last 5 to 10 years, as the far right has also risen in different forms across the world, not just in the global north, but also in other parts of the world. I mean, most notably, we could cite Brazil and India. Now we know, as has already been stated, that migrant women workers are predominantly in those low-paid and vulnerable roles. But when we look at it through the lens of the pandemic, the healthcare systems in particular that have essentially sustained many northern countries, we will find many migrant women there, but also not just in the so-called developed countries. And like informal women traders, they are effectively, more likely to be on the front line in spaces where they can also contract the virus. And this is then compounded by the fact that they are less likely to have access to healthcare and wider financial safety nets. And the travel restrictions mean that they are unable to pursue alternatives elsewhere or indeed return home. And as those job losses across the sectors have racked up, women migrant workers are usually the first to be let go. And, the multiple impacts of this have already been discussed. So, remittances have notably dropped as a result of the pandemic. There is data and statistics out there that shows it as a regional level. And so the dual vulnerabilities that migrant women face by being both women and migrants mean that their families have disproportionately borne the impacts of those drops. Now, we have heard how, multiple times how this pandemic has exposed the systemic inequalities at play within the prevailing neoliberal economic system that relies on minimal state protections, and is constantly convincing particularly developing countries that this is actually the economic model they need to follow, despite the contrary actually occurring, in the influencing countries in the global north. But also, essentially the vertical vulnerabilities of international globalized trade, which has become heavily geared towards export markets. And what we are now seeing proven once again is, the international trade and labor architecture is still so heavily dependent on women's cheap labor as a source of comparative advantage, all that we have already said. And very specifically, what comes with that is a deregulation of the private sector that often works in tandem with international trade. So what you find is that women's labor and migrant women's labor is even more exploited and often cynically used at national level towards this end. And Crecentia spoke to that to a certain extent. So what you have is migrants actively sought out by national governments in order to keep wages low under the pressure of, large private sector lobbying. And migrant and domestic labor is effectively pitted against each other, so successfully dividing and successfully conquering the proletariat to that end, the working classes. So during times of crisis, such as this pandemic, we see how women, including migrant women, have played a dual role as both cannon fodder within labor markets in the fight against the pandemic. So, being front line, being at the coalface, but also are very easily disposable assets to be shed as and when needed, as the ships of enterprise effectively struggle to stay afloat, but to stay afloat while, trying to maintain their profit margins as best as possible. What's often not made clear in the rhetoric around getting women into informal employment through increased liberalized trade, into more formal employment through increased liberalized trade, is that women's cheap and unprotected labor is a source of competitive advantage for industries, is actually a competitive disadvantage for women in the world of work. It effectively moves you from informalized precarity to formalized precarity, unless all of those protections which require serious state engagement and state regulation are allowed to come into play. And this is often what is not allowed to happen as trade agreements and trade liberalization go forward. So, in terms of women-centered approaches to trade and, the labor architecture, what we require is not just a nodding acceptance to these realities, which have been stated for so many years and which the COVID pandemic has further exposed and shone a light on, and we've been talking about this for, the whole of the past year, but we need an active shift towards a feminist approach to the world of work, and at the most preliminary level, this is about movement building. It's about feminist approaches to trade unionism at domestic, regional, and international levels. It's about feminist and allied engagement in trade liberalization processes. Now, that's acknowledging the fact that stakeholder engagement with trade liberalization is immensely problematic, and we are effectively continuously locked out and blocked out of those processes, and a lot of the jargon that surrounds trade in particular means that it is not very accessible, and all of that needs to be fundamentally addressed. But trade deals themselves need to move beyond, and this is something that I feel particularly angry about on many days, what has become sort of a current co-option of the gender and trade language and the rhetoric that then flows from that. So the language of opportunities for women to join the economy and the narrative of industrial inclusion is effectively meaningless if these exploitative and unequal realities continue to be ignored. But they are being ignored for the most part, and arguably in the most insidious way we have seen yet. It's because we're no longer talking, or we're no longer in the space where, trade and trade liberalization are declared as being gender neutral. Instead, we are in a more dangerous ground of having the long years of work done pinkwashed, and I'm borrowing Jayati Ghosh's words here, through a variety of tick box approaches to gender and trade that are really becoming incredibly problematic, to put it mildly. Recently, for example, the inclusion of gender and women's economic empowerment chapters in trade agreements are often hailed as a step forward in addressing women's equality through trade. However, these chapters in themselves are often far from penetrative, ignore specific language about mitigating against the negative effects of trade liberalization, that is barely touched, and instead focus on bringing women into value chains that have already been exposed for many years as being exploitative, without any sort of discussion around the recommendations. Here in the UK, the Japan UK Economic Partnership Agreement has recently been held for having one of those chapters. I have had a look at it, and to be honest with you, it does not do much from my perspective. From my reading of it, the commitments there are very, very shallow indeed. But the problem is, it seems like such an uphill struggle. This is seen as a win, but the question we have to ask ourselves is, if this win then deflects from the real struggle, where will we be left with? Then recently also I think it's the Canada-Chile agreement has had, sort of similar claps around it. I have not read that one yet, so I will not comment on it, but we need to interrogate this. All of this needs to be effectively nipped in the bud. And the truth of the matter is, if we want a feminist approach to labor and trade, we're going to require a significant ideological shift from the current orthodoxies around trade and development that dominate what our policymakers are being asked to work with. So you have some who are actually committed to that ideology, to the neoliberal ideology of open markets and the vagaries of market fluctuations that flow from that. And then there are many others, to be more optimistic about it, who are simply having to work within those parameters because it is so dominant. And we need to be able to organize around effectively tackling that. And I think I will stop there. I'm sure I've blown my time as well. So
You're awesome. Thank you so much, Fatimah. And I think also thank you for really centering this in the structural dilemmas. I mean, the pinkwashing, this kind of leaned in approach to international trade, and you have even officialized feminism like Canada, right? So Prime Minister Trudeau and his feminist approach to free trade agreements, and which upon closer inspection don't look a heck of a lot different to anything else that we've seen before. And that's kind of like the pink washing in chief. And I think you mentioned as well, very importantly, cannon fodder. And that links in very importantly to what Crecentia also mentioned, that between states, the women are in the no man's land or no woman's land. And this notion of being formalized or informalized, and anybody who knows me, that language and that linguistic precision is a bee in my bonnet, so that we're all precarious now. So there's no real notion of being safely employed, the definitional challenges of what employment means in the time of COVID, the definitional challenges of what it means to be a migrant, because in many respects, the notion that we're all in a time and a place of flux, moving in different places. And I suppose also these kind of vertical and horizontal vulnerabilities. So states not being safe spaces, but also the columns of policy, which should be the architecture of protection, and in the best way, not protectionism in the jingoistic, racist, sexist, patriarchal way that states have deployed these. So thank you so much, sisters. As always, thank you to the three of you for bringing it, as I knew you would, in fact. So I think I'd love to just go through some of the questions here and see, I'm just gonna go.
Yeah, Paulo, I've got a lineup if that would help.
It would help greatly, thank you.
Sure. Leah Sullivan had a question, and then Foluke Adenok and Amina Mama, who have written comments, and we would invite them.
Yeah,
so I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Carol. Foluke, do you want to speak your truth, sister? If you're still on the call.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am speaking from Nigeria, and I have the opportunity of working, with women, and also working on the International Organization for Migration case management for reintegration. And I have observed that the rising case of violence, particularly in Europe, it's very harmful to women, not just in terms of trade, but in terms of their social development. You have women returning with children that are unable to care for due to incidents of prostitution, women getting pregnant, or some having children, and the father of the children got caught up in violence and got killed. So these are issues, social issues that are generating from irregular migration, and I thought it's something that we should look at. And looking at the Africa Free Trade Agreement in Nigeria, we know how the ease of doing business, it's very difficult, in Nigeria, and the effect on women, entrepreneurs. And I just thought, for women, particularly those who traded before the colonial periods, and those in the rural areas, they rely so much, on trade by barter. They focus on what they don't need and what they can get from other people, without, looking at other, a dimension of factors that the modern economists look at. So I'm just wondering if there's a way that as women we could leverage some of those tools that we have used. Maybe we can fine-tune them to see how we combat restrictions from government when it comes to trade, particularly within the continent, because it's very difficult. Being entrepreneurship activities is very difficult for women within the continent, even much more than trading with partners outside of the continent. Thank you.
Thanks for looking. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a very rich palette for us to think about. I'd like to ask Leah. I think there are a couple of questions from you, questions/comments. So maybe you can just compress them in about 2 minutes. Leah.
Thank you. Sorry, I have so many. It was a really interesting discussion. So the first one I had was in relation to the AFCFTA, because I've heard some sort of critiques of the trade agreement, given that, well, I'd heard that with some countries they hadn't signed up to the freedom of movement portion of the agreement. some of the bigger economies, and also that the deal doesn't sort of reflect the fact that the economic policy space is restricted to such a degree that you cannot bring about the kind of structural transformation that the continent needs. And I'm also looking into some research at the moment on the impact of the EU Africa bilateral FTAs on deindustrialization and job losses, and wondering if any of the speakers had any ideas about the impacts that had on out-migration from those countries. And finally, what, if anything, can we do against pink washing?
Thank you, Leah. Yeah, pinkwashing is the bee in the bonnet, and I think the AfCFTA, as with other free trade agreements, offers some instructive lessons, and I think it's quite a cautionary tale in many respects. I'd like to also invite Amina, Mama, Comrade Big Sister, to, I think she's got an announcement as well, which I think it would be useful for us to hear about the possibility of a publication. Amina. She's still there? Maybe not. Is Jiva on the call? Maybe not. Okay, I'm gonna be the super sub. I think the announcement here is that Amina said it's long overdue for Feminist Africa to produce an issue on migration and trade, especially with all the men's politicking and rhetoric on the AfCFTA, my favorite abbreviation, ongoing. We are open for concept notes, folks with expertise, to perhaps co-edit with one of our new team of editors. If this interests you, please contact editor@feministafrica.net. Also, our project officer, Jiva. Amina, there you are. He's also attending this event.
I was just talking to Sylvia, one of our co-editors in Kampala.
Okay, so now that you're here, you say it properly, because I might have misrepresented you. Hi.
Hi, I'm sorry, I stepped out to take Sylvia's call on the issue, because we're trying to figure out, how to promote it. I didn't hear what you said.
I was just highlighting what you had mentioned in the chat room, so I thought maybe it's a good opportunity for you to make the announcement again.
Wow, live announcement. Well, here we are, all on lockdown under COVID. Yes, no, as people who used to follow Feminist Africa know, it was at Cape Town for the first 10 years, from 2002 onwards. And then in 2017, we did one more issue on mobilization, and then closed down to relocate. So we've now started up again. It took a bit longer than we planned, because we thought we'd get going in another year or two. And well, life in Africa's institutions is challenging, and we wanted to make sure we did a good job. So we've actually even taken a step of hiring one person so far, and that's Jifa, who's on this platform. Jifa Tovike recently finished her PhD in a very interesting and relevant area. Hi, Jifa. So but that's it. Thank you for opening up this space to me to say that we're really excited, and we want it to become more open and more inclusive, and probably do some open issues. We've been having to manage the editorial load by doing just thematic issues. So we want to open it up more and invite everyone to go onto the webpage, which Jifa's just reposting. And subscribe, then you'll get our notices. And we look forward to growing the community back, because after 3 years of COVID, and we feel we might have lost a lot of the audience that were regular visitors and readers. So that's why I'm pushing it and saying, look, we're back. That's all really.
Thank you.
My colleagues, it's still a very strong community, and I always say we were the first of Africa to go open access and online. So we paved the way. Now there are many, many online open access journals. Just to say that we're back, and we're still free, open access online.
We're back, and We're glad to see you back. Thank you so much. And especially at this time, we need the repository, we need the spaces for collective thinking, collective imagination, and also action-orientated writing and co-creation. So thank you so much. Yeah, I'd like to invite our panelists to respond to some of these questions, and I don't expect each panelist to respond to all of them, just whatever resonates, but also that each of the panelists are aware of kind of trigger questions that I also added in the briefing. So perhaps you could just compress your final remarks and your final, you know, your inputs, your responses to this with also with the notion of where states are, because I think that's very central. Is this are we having a kind of a moment where we can actually rethink and reimagine states? Am I thinking over ambitiously, which wouldn't be the first time I've been told this, that this could potentially decolonize our policy spaces, it could potentially decolonize our own interrelational ways of relating to states, and actually take the state away from the state in new ways. What those look like, I'm not sure, and I'm grateful for these sorts of arenas and platforms for that co-creativity. So I'll turn it first to Mariama again to perhaps respond to some of the pieces around that. Hi, Mariama.
Hi. So great. Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation of Fatimah and Crecentia. And the questions are really thought-provoking and really important jumping off point and continuation points. I think the first point I'd like to flag a little bit is about these FTAs and so forth, and link that with the juxtaposition of the emergence of quote-unquote feminist foreign policies that are occurring among developed countries, Sweden, even some Mexico and others, and Canada, of course, and that these feminist foreign policies, to be really feminist, have to open up these boxes of trade, migration, and all of those, and care within the context of that discussion. Otherwise, they're just names. So we need to really push on that envelope to the extent that some of the partners are talking about that. I think one of the weakest part of our FTAs, and I mean among developing countries, including CARICOM, the region where I'm from, is on this issue of movement of labor. That's where a lot of it falls apart. Even if they do manage to get nice language, the implementation at the level of customs and immigration is very, not just problematic, it's bad. We have people, customs officials deciding to stop persons from St. Lucia or Jamaica coming in, despite the fact that there's a free movement of labor. And I don't think that's unusual. I think it's very much, I don't know Asia, so I'm not sure about the Asian discussions, but I've been following a lot of the African things, and certainly within the context of Southern Africa and some of the bigger, richer developed countries. This is a huge problem. And it's something that feminists have not gone into, and it's something that we really need to tread into with seriousness and data driven. So I really welcome the potential of the Africa volume on migration, because I think we need to get into this debate. So I think that a weak point in our thing. I think the EU discussion about deindustrialization and labor and stuff, I have a lot of allergic reactions to EU discussions about supporting labor, supporting people in developing countries. Because when you look at their negotiating agenda and how they negotiate, it's very hard-nosed and it's very mercantile in terms of what they propose in the post-Cotonou discussion and Cotonou before it and the post-Cotonou, and in terms of even their intervention and their participation at a distance in the ACFTA through many of the Francophone countries and other Lusophone countries and so forth, right? So we need to really decide for ourselves and push on that. And that means that we need to really open up some of these discussions. And that brings us to the point that you're talking about. What does this moment really present for us? Unfortunately, my dear sister, I think from the point of view of our government, this moment does not present a moment for rethinking development, for redoing policy, with few exceptions. I think many of them are caught in a reactive mode, and they are caught in this whole thing about building back better. And then you say, well, what is it you're building back better to? And then they'll throw building forward, which is the World Bank kind of thing, building forward. And so we then need to really sit down and maybe have more of this type of discussion about how do we intervene? What is the space within our movement as Pan-Africanists to really present some platforms that government can utilize and making allies within our governments? Because we know our governments are not homogeneous. We have people within inside government in different departments, in the African Union, in the African Commission, in some of the CARICOM institutions, who really would like to move this movement on. It potentially, this pause, whatever, however long, potentially it's unearthed so much that's bad about globalization, that's horrible about the development models that we use, and the fact that we pride ourselves on sending people to US and Canada and other places to work as nurses and doctors, or even we still have farm labor program in Jamaica where we send workers to pick sugarcane in Florida. And our ministers who are in charge of these things are still happy when they negotiate stuff. This is 19th century, pre-19th century, 18th century kind of colonial residual things that are left over. And so this, it's not going to be done by our governments. The kind of inspiratory, visionary actions that you are thinking and envisioning, our governments are not there. But our civil society have to move as much as we can, sharing from our different spaces, strategies and tactics, and helping to foster that, and helping to foster a discussion that talks about care, that talks about the role of women in migration, that opens up that fudgy sinkhole of migration, movement of labor that our governments give lip service to across countries. That fear, that xenophobic fear of your neighbor next door and what they might bring or what might not bring. And then open up the potentiality of what it means when you have a diaspora, whether the diaspora is in Nigeria or in South Africa or in Ghana, and how you can utilize those new way of thinking about diaspora and new ways of thinking about migrants, welcoming them, providing social things. And of course, you have to do that to your population too. To the extent that we still have population that are living in destitution, then the migration problem become a problem, between the receiving citizens and those who are coming in. So at home, we have to fix our problems. And I think certainly Africa has the resource, the mind, the brains, the knowledge, the skills to do it. But why do we still act in this colonial mentality? And that's something that we need to shift. And I think this should have opened it. The financial crisis, I thought, would have opened a window. That got slammed really quickly. This should have opened a big, gigantic wall blown through all of the development nonsense. But how do we move on it? And we have to have these conversations and then put pen to paper and start strategizing and targeting those of our governments who are friendly. I hear your Ghanaian president is talking lots of good, rhetoric, and others, and we have to work with them. Yeah.
Yeah. Sounds like a plan. Thanks, Mariama. And I think, the piece on what I would call basically institutionalized, officialized skills trafficking between states is, and which does replicate often gendered feudal labor relations, as you rightly say, which are steeped in a colonial Fordist model. Exactly, are a point of great contention, and how do we dismantle that? And perhaps that's a good place to dovetail to Crecentia to briefly give some responses and compress those with closing remarks as well. Comrade Crecentia.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to comrades who have put some comments on this topic. But I was going to say that the current development had really created an opportunity for better world. But can we achieve it? I don't think we can with corrupt government who are stealing resources of workers, of people of their nationals. I don't think it is possible now. But I think it is possible when civil society come together and really put forward what we need, what we see as a better future for all. And I think that we have really an opportunity to do that, to really, as we put our views on the table, but also to call the government to book, because I mean, if you read the stories about medication being stolen, COVID-19 properties being stolen by government officials, you can imagine what we are talking about. I think that there shouldn't be anything stopping us as feminists, even at the the Africa Trade Agreement, to put forward the views of people, how we see it, to try and decolonize our societies and decolonize our nations. Otherwise, if we ignore and we say we are excluded, they will do that. They will exclude us from the discussion. They will kick us out. I think I was saying that in my mind, that all struggles are won in the battle. Struggles are not won being silent. We need to be vocal about the challenges that we are facing, and we need to make sure that gender ACFTA do appear. We must point out the challenges of the current process. We must point out the challenges of exclusion and make sure that we are all included in the process so that we can have a better future and a new normal, a normal that is sensitive to migrant workers, a normal that is sensitive to age, sensitive to all all societies in our world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Crecentia. I think the take home for me there is struggles are won in the battles, not in sidelined silence. Yeah, I think I don't even want to add peanut butter or jam to that beautiful piece of toast there. I'd like to ask Fatimah to also respond in brief to some of the resonant questions and also give a final flurry.
Thank you so much, Lebohang. Yeah, it's so hard to come at the end of this really great session where so much has already been said. I think I'll keep it very specific to the CFTA, perhaps. So the first thing to share is that there'll be a Pan-African feminist paper released next week, Friday, on the CFTA, on African CFTA by Femnet, the organization Femnet, and there will actually be a webinar with that as well, where the CFTA will be discussed and debated by various people. So please do look out for that. So in terms of the CFTA itself, I've been reading some of the comments. Amina Mama, I cannot agree with you more. It's like, seriously. So, you know, the deep iniquities of it, the fact that it does not pay any mind really to people or gender, and reproducing all of existing inequalities. I mean, in many ways, this is the thrust of my paper. And that's because we need to look at the model. You know, so I think first and foremost, it's very important to absolutely state that, you know, from my own positioning, that I am not against African economic integration. And this is the place where anybody who criticizes the CFTA could find themselves easily blocked. And that is also a struggle that we need to address, right? As a Pan-Africanist, you cannot technically be against African economic integration because that has been one of the founding principles of Pan-Africanism going back to the pre- and post-independence movements. But the model that you follow for that can have many different shades. And this particular model is a very, very neoliberal capitalist one. And the liberalization process is immensely rapid. You know, we're looking at full liberalization, you know, when it starts, if it starts, and if it goes according to plan, in effectively 10 years, right? And even for least developed countries, they are only given a few additional years on top of that. And we're talking liberalization at, I think, 95 or 97%. I can't remember exactly. And I think it's very telling that the movement of people protocol has not been signed by as many as those who have signed the agreement itself. So the agreement itself has been signed by everybody except for Eritrea. And the protocol, I think, is 37 last time I checked. It could be a few more now. And what that tells you straight away is, we're back to this space where governments and those in power are very happy for goods and services to move, but not people. And actually, people are put into the service of the movement of goods and services, but they themselves, cannot be moved. And the protocol itself, to be honest with you, also needs to go further. The last time I looked at it was about 5 months ago, so I don't want to say anything completely inaccurate, but from what I understand, there is free movement for the first 3 months, and then after that, national level criteria kicks in, pretty much what Sister Crecentia was saying. And so all of the discriminations and agendas that come into play with that effectively then kick in. So that protocol itself needs to be interrogated, and hopefully we'll be able to see someone do that from a feminist perspective. So I think that's the first thing we need to do. We need to actually look at this deal in great detail, and we need to question it, and we need to move past the initial euphoria of the fact that this is going to integrate us economically and look at what the possible impacts will be in those first 10 years, because every liberalization process brings with it adjustment, huge adjustment costs. Now that's the lingo that we use in trade, but actually in real life that means people are going to lose jobs. That means people are going to fall into poverty. That means countries are going to have to find ways to replace trade related taxation. That means that effectively countries are going to have to find huge resources in order to prepare themselves to compete, and they will be competing with one another within the country. Let's make no mistake about that. And we have a very unequal continent. We have 3 countries that contribute more than 50% of GDP to the entire continent, and we have the most least developed countries in the world within any continent. We have the majority, effectively. So all of these things need to be taken into consideration. What is being done to mitigate against all of that prevailing inequality? We have to ask those questions. And throughout all of that, women are going to bear an additional brunt. We know this from all the past analysis that has already been done. And I think, to answer your point, this brings me on to, the additional questions you wanted us to look at. Actually, this is an opportunity to rethink things, right? Because if we are going to really go back to the ideological premise of Pan-Africanism through the CFTA, we are going to be questioning the idea of borders and nation states. We are going to be talking about, collective, a policy of solidarity, actually. So, it does need, a political unity around this, not just an economic one. And so we have to ask questions about where is the money coming from, especially post-COVID. Why is the EU so happy for us to do this agreement? That already has my alarm bells ringing, so we need to be really, very, very interrogative with this. And we have to take it actually back to the ideology and back to the politics, and let's all start reading Nkrumah and Cabral and and all of our founding parents in the Pan-Africanist space, if we actually want to find solutions, because that is still relevant and still applicable now, but we have forgotten it, and I think it's time to go back there. And I completely agree with Mariama. We have a lot of people who we can ally with, both inside and outside of government, and that's the strategic and tactical approach that we need to take. And I will stop there.
And all good things come to an end. So thank you so much, Fatimah, for really a wonderful rallying cry. And, whenever people mention our founding parents, like Nkrumah, like Cabral, I get a bit excited because there's a bias, but I think I need to really appreciate the 3 speakers, Mariama Williams, Crecentia Mofokeng, and Fatimah Kelleher, for really bringing it, for really situating our intersectional analysis of trade and migration, particularly through a feminist lens, very carefully and very, very preciously. I'd also like to appreciate both the Women Migration Network and the Gender and Trade Coalition, and all of the people who've joined us here today. And on that note, I'd like to close with a brief poem, if I may, because it just seems like a poetic Friday, doesn't it? So, in brief, just as a call to arms, whilst we're imagining these decolonized and decolonized spaces, The guns may stay silent, but you will not. And because of that, because of you, we can still hold the hand of a child, talk to them quietly about the goodness of hearts and people's ability to learn from the past, to become kinder, to become radical, to become braver, and to be the reminder to world that human rights, women's rights, and our rights are for us all. I am the one who will save. And with that, I think we can close this wonderful session. I'm not sure if my co-conspirators, Carol or Kathy, have anything to add, but I thank all of us this afternoon.
Yes, we can't end without, I put it in the chat, but we can't end without the deepest thanks to Liepollo, who was the inspiration behind this conversation, identified our amazing panelists and framed this and pulled it all together. So we want to express our great thanks to Liepollo. And also just to thank the collaboration. The Women in Migration Network is a member of the Gender and Trade Coalition, and we're looking forward to more ways to bring these two spheres together, as you've identified how closely they're related. And please do look for the recording in a few days on YouTube under Women in Migration. We'll also send out the link to you all as registrants of the event. So thank you all for your participation, and deep thanks to the panelists and to Liepollo.